This is part 31 of Angular 2 tutorial. In this video, we'll discuss how to pass parameters to routes in Angular. This is continuation to part 30. In part 30, we discuss the basics of routing. So please watch part 30 before proceeding. Here is what we want to be able to do. We want to convert this employee code column within our employee list component to a clickable hyperlink. And when any user clicks on the employee code, we want to redirect the user to a URL that looks like this. Notice this last piece of the URL segment right here. This is the employee code on which the user has clicked. So when a user clicks on any of the employee code, then we want to send that specific employee code to the route as a parameter. And then within our destination component, which is going to be the employee component, this component reads that parameter value from the URL and then calls the server-side web API service, retrieving that specific employee details and then displaying those details as you can see right here. So let's see how to achieve this using route parameters in Angular. So the first step is to create a route with a parameter. Notice this new route right here. Now here we are specifying a parameter using / and colon. In our case, we are passing employee code as parameter, so I named it code. Now when Angular router sees a route like this, we want it to redirect the user to employee component, which displays that specific employee details. So first, let's go ahead and create this route. So let's flip over to Visual Studio, and within our app.module.ts file, here let's define our route with parameter. So our next step is to bind to the route that we have just created using router link directive. Notice in this case we are binding the router link directive to an array, and this array has got two elements. This is the first element and here is the second element. This array is called link parameters array. The first element in the array is the path of the route to the destination component, and the second element in the array is the route parameter value, in our case employee code. Notice the route that we have here has got a parameter in it. So when we bind to that route using router link directive, we'll have to pass a value for that parameter. In our case, we want employee code, so we are using the code property of the employee object. Another important point to note here is the square brackets that we are using with the router link directive. Notice in this case we are binding the router link directive to link parameters array, and to get the employee code we are binding to the code property of the employee object. So to tell Angular that we are using property binding, we'll have to use this square brackets. On the other hand, if we are binding the router link directive to just a string like we did in our previous video, so for example, if we look at this app.component.ts, here we are using router link directive to bind to the string home. In this case we are binding it to employees. So here we are binding it just to a string. So in this case we don't have to use the square brackets, but here we are binding it to link parameters array and to the property of the employee object. So to denote property binding, we have to use square brackets, otherwise it may not work as expected. So now let's use router link directive to bind to the route that we have created with employee code parameter. So within our employee list component HTML file, here is the TD that displays employee code. Now we want to turn the employee code to a clickable hyperlink. So let's use an anchor element here, and then let's use our router link directive. We know we are going to bind this to a property, so let's use a pair of square brackets to denote property binding, and in this case we are binding it to a link parameters array. So to denote an array we use pair of square brackets, and the first element of the array is the path of the route to the destination component. In our case it is / employees. That's the path of the route. And then this route that we are binding to also has a parameter employee code, so we need to pass a value for that parameter. And to get employee code, we are going to use this employee object that we are iterating over. So this object will be available within this TD right here, so we can use that object and then the code property of the employee object to get that specific employee code, and this will be passed to the route parameter. And let's close our anchor element, and then let's move this closing anchor element just before the closing TD that we have right here, and let's format this a bit. Now we want a service method which is going to return us employee by code. We provide that method with an employee code, and we want that method to return that specific employee details. Now if you look at the Web API service that we have built in one of our previous videos, at the moment this Web API service has got two variations of get method. The first get method right here returns us the list of all employee objects, whereas this one takes in an employee code and returns us that specific employee object. But if you look at our client side service, our Angular service, which is present in this file right here, employee.service.ts, we only have this getEmployees method which returns us the list of all employees. Now we want another method here which is going to call the Web API server-side method, which accepts employee code as a parameter and returns that specific employee object. So let's create a method right here which is going to call that Web API method and returns us that specific employee object. So here this method is very similar to what we have right here. We want a specific employee, so we are passing that employee code as a parameter. Employee code is of type string, so the data type is string. And then this method returns an observable of iEmployee array, but here we are getting only one employee, so it returns observable of iEmployee. And here we are issuing a request to this URL API/employees, and in the URL we are also passing the employee code. And where are we getting this employee code from? That is coming into the method as a parameter. And then this server-side Web API service is going to return us that specific employee object. Now this map operator is going to transform that response, the employee object, to iEmployee type. And then we are using the catch operator to handle any errors. So this code is very similar to what we have in getEmployees method. Now let's quickly recap what we have done so far. We have created a route with a parameter, and then we are binding to that route using router link directive. So with this step, we should have the employee code within our employee list component clickable, and when we click employee code, it should pass that specific employee code in the URL. So let's quickly test that. So with all the changes that we have done so far, let's run our application by pressing Ctrl F5. We have the home page here. Now let's click on the employees tab and we see the list of employees. If you don't see the list of employees and if you see a message saying problem with the service, make sure you have your Web API service running. And look at this employee code column here. Every employee code is clickable, and when I click on a specific employee code, that employee code is passed as a parameter in the URL. And here we have a component which displays employee details, but at the moment the data within this employee component is hard-coded. So whenever we click on any employee, we see the same details here. Now what we want to do is read the employee code from the URL and then call this method getEmployeeByCode and pass it the employee code. This is going to call the server-side Web API method, and that's going to retrieve the data for that employee from the database table, and we will use this employee component to display that specific employee details. So the first step is to read this parameter value from the URL, and to do that we are going to make use of activated route service provided by Angular. Now let's take a look at the employee component that we have created in one of our previous videos. Here is the TypeScript file of that employee component. Notice the data for the employee is hard-coded within the component class. We don't need all these properties in this method, so I'm going to delete them. And we are going to make use of iEmployee interface that we created in one of our previous videos, and that interface is present in this file, employee.ts. Notice here we have iEmployee interface with all our employee properties. Now we want to use this interface within our employee component, so let's include the required import statement, and then within our component class I'm going to create a property. Let's call it employee. This property is going to keep track of the employee object that we are going to receive from our Angular service. So the type of this is going to be our interface type, iEmployee, which we have imported from this file. Next, we're going to make use of the activated route service provided by Angular to retrieve the parameter value from the URL. So let's import activated route service from Angular router. We also need employee service to issue a service call. So let's include the required import statement for employee service. This activated route is provided as a service by Angular. So let's use this employee component class constructor to specify a dependency on that activated route. And the way we do that is by using the constructor. So here notice we are including a parameter to the constructor of type activated route. Now at runtime, the Angular injector is going to provide an instance of this activated route service for us. So this is dependency injection. We will discuss dependency injection in detail in our upcoming videos. For now, understand that if we specify a service as a dependency like this using the constructor, then the Angular is automatically going to provide us an instance of that service. Just like how we need this activated route service provided by Angular, we also need an instance of employee service. So we include that also as a dependency using the class constructor. So within our employee component, let's include a constructor with those two dependencies. Next, let's retrieve the route parameter value from the URL and then use that value to call our employee service method. Let's do that within onInit lifecycle hook. So first, let's import onInit lifecycle hook from Angular core, and then let's make our class implement the lifecycle hook. And then within the class, let's provide the implementation for ng onInit lifecycle hook method. So within this method, we write the code to retrieve the route parameter value first. Let's use this activated route service for that. So this dot underscore activated route dot snapshot, we're going to use snapshot approach to retrieve the route parameter values. There are different ways to retrieve route parameter values. We'll discuss all those different ways and when to use what in our upcoming videos. For now, let's use the snapshot approach. So snapshot dot params, and then we specify the name of our parameter. Remember the name of our parameter, it is code. So this name should match with the name of the parameter that we have specified in our route configuration. So if you look at this app.module.ts, look at the name of the parameter here, it's code. So this name should match that. So we have the route parameter value. Let's create a variable here. Let's call it employee code, and this is going to be of type string. So we are using the variable to store the route parameter value. Next, let's call the service method. So this dot underscore employee service dot get employee by code, and to this method we pass our employee code that we have retrieved from the URL, and what we are getting back is an observable. So let's subscribe to the observable. To subscribe, we use the subscribe function. When the observable successfully emits an item, we can specify a callback function. So this function is going to receive that employee object. So let's use that to set this property right here, the employee property. So this dot employee equals whatever we get back from the service. And then in case if there is an error, then we can specify an error callback function as well. So when there is an error, what do we want to do with that? Let's log the error to the console. So let's use the console statement, console.log, and let's pass the error object to that. And then we want to display a generic error message to the end user instead of showing him the actual exception. For that, let's create a variable here. Let's call it status message. And this is going to be of type string. And then let's set that status message variable to a general message like problem with the service, please try again after some time. So at this point, when the service successfully emits an item, that is the employee object, this property employee will have that employee object. Next, within our employee component HTML file, let's include the required HTML to bind to the employee object properties. So let's open our employee component HTML file, which is right here. And then here I'm going to paste some HTML. Notice I have the table element here and I'm using ngIf and then employee property. So we are binding to this employee property. Now if employee property is true, meaning it is initialized with an employee object, only then display this table element. That's what this ngIf is telling here. And then we have the table head, which basically displays this header, employee details. We have table body here, and within every row we have the title, employee code, and then we are binding to the code property of the employee object. Similarly, we are displaying name, gender, annual salary, and date of birth. Now we also have this status message variable here. If something goes wrong, we are setting this property to this message, problem with the service, please try again after some time. So if there is any problem, let's display this message to the user, and to do that let's use another div element right here after the table element, and let's use the ngIf structural directive on that, equals not of employee. So if employee is not true, then we want to bind to this status message property. So whatever message we have in that property will be displayed. So with all these changes in place, let's run our application by pressing Ctrl F5. We see the home page. Now let's click on the employees tab. We see the list of employees. Let's click on one of the employee codes. Look at that, nothing happens. It doesn't display anything. So let's launch Browser Developer Tools and investigate what's going on. So we are on the console tab. We have got one error. Look at the error message right here. No provider for employee service. So basically Angular is complaining that we have not registered employee service. Now if you look at our employee component, notice we are injecting employee service into this component, but we have not registered the service. If you look at our employee list component, even this component needs employee service. Notice we are injecting it here and we are registering the service using the providers property of the component decorator. One way to fix this error is by registering the service again with an employee component by using the providers property of this component decorator. By registering the service twice, we no longer get a singleton. We get two instances of this employee service, and that's not a very good practice. In our upcoming videos, we'll discuss what is a singleton and why is it important to register a service at an appropriate level within our application. For now, to fix this error, let's move the service registration to Angular module. At the moment within our application, we only have one module, that is the root application module, app.module.ts. By registering a service within a module, then that service is available for all the components within our application. So let's move the providers property from our employee list component to our app module. So let's open this app.module.ts. We have the module decorator here at ngModule. So let's use the providers property here and register our employee service. We also need to import this employee service. So let's include the required import statement. Import, we want to import employee service, and that is present in employee folder, and the name of the file is employee.service. Let's save all our changes and reload our web page. Notice now we see the list of all employees. When we click on a specific employee, we see that employee details. Let's click on another employee and we see that specific employee details. Now let's try to navigate to an employee that does not exist. We don't have an employee with this code EMP109. Look at what happens. It doesn't display anything. Now what we want to do is display a message saying employee with the specified code does not exist. To achieve this, within our employee component, we have this method right here. This arrow function is the one which is called when the observable emits an item. So what we want to do here is include the check for null. So here we will check if employee data parameter is null. If it is null, then what we want to do is set the status message variable that we have right here to this message. Employee with the specified employee code does not exist. So if it is null, that means we didn't get any employee back. So we want to just display this message to the user. Else, if it is not null, then we want to set the employee property with the data that we get back. So let's format this a bit. Let's save our changes and reload this page. Notice now we see the message employee with the specified employee code does not exist. We know we have an employee with employee code 101, so when we provide that employee code, we should see that specific employee details. We have another issue here. Let me explain what I mean. Let's rebuild our solution. So let's go to the Solution Explorer, right click on the solution and select this option to rebuild. So rebuild all started. It's going to take a few seconds to rebuild the solution. Rebuild all succeeded, as you can see here. Now let's issue a request. Notice we want to see employee 101. That's the employee code we have in the URL. So let's reload this page. Now this is the first request after we have rebuilt the solution. So the application is busy being JIT compiled. So it's taking some time to load data. But during this wait time, we're not displaying any message to the user. So the user is in a confused state. Is the application working, not working? Now it would have been much better if we have displayed a message saying loading data, please wait. When the data becomes available, it automatically appears on the page, as you can see right here. So let's see how to display that status message. To display the status message, what we can do is initialize this field right here, status message, to that default message, loading data, please wait. So while we are waiting for the data to load, this is the message that will be displayed to the user. So let's save our changes and reload this web page. Notice now it displays loading data, please wait, and then the data appears as expected. At the moment we are using hash style routing. Let's also test this with HTML5 routing. To enable HTML5 routing back, let's go to our app.module.ts file and we just remove this property right here, use hash true, and within our web.config file, let's enable the rewrite rule that we have. So at the moment the URL rewrite rule is commented here, so let's uncomment this and run our application one more time by pressing Ctrl F5. Notice now we have HTML5 style routing instead of hash style routing. Let's click on the employees tab. We see the list of employees. Let's click on one of the employees and we see that specific employee details as expected. Thank you for listening and have a great day.